There are evenings that seem designed by Providence to remind one of the fragility of human certainties, and the night of Lady Pemberton's Sapphire Masquerade was assuredly one of them. The ballroom of Grosvenor House glittered with an almost supernatural brilliance, as if some celestial decorator had scattered diamonds across black velvet and called it a ceiling. The theme, Mysteries of the Orient, had been embraced with the enthusiasm that only London's elite can muster when charity and spectacle converge in perfect harmony. I confess that I felt rather distinguished in my Turkish pasha costume, complete with jeweled turban and silk robes that rustled most satisfactorily with each step. The transformation of familiar faces behind elaborate masks created an atmosphere of delicious uncertainty. One might be conversing with a duchess or a diplomat, and the mystery added a piquant flavor to even the most mundane exchanges. The centerpiece of the evening, both literally and figuratively, was the legendary Star of Kashmir, a sapphire of such extraordinary size and clarity that it seemed to capture the very essence of a midnight sky. The gem rested within an ornate glass vitrine at the head of the ballroom, surrounded by a constellation of smaller jewels from Lady Pemberton's renowned collection. A discreet placard informed the curious that the sapphire was valued at over £50,000, though whispered conversations suggested its true worth lay in its romantic history. A gift from a Maharaja to his beloved, later sold to pay for a kingdom's freedom. The evening's guest list read like a page from Debrett's, though tonight their identities were delightfully obscured. Sir Reginald Blackwood, Lady Pemberton's business partner, cut an imposing figure as a Chinese mandarin, his shrewd eyes glittering behind a mask of painted silk. His wife, the former Miss Clarissa Thornton, had chosen the costume of a Japanese geisha, though her nervous manner suggested she found the evening's festivities more trial than pleasure. Near the French windows, Dr. Marcus Ashford, Lady Pemberton's personal physician and rumored romantic interest, stood resplendent as a Persian prince, his distinguished bearing unmistakable despite his elaborate disguise. Miss Vivian Cartwright, Lady Pemberton's secretary and closest confidant, had selected the role of an Egyptian queen, her usually severe demeanor softened by flowing robes and golden ornaments. The most intriguing figure, however, was the gentleman in the corner who had chosen to appear as a Venetian doge, his identity completely obscured by an elaborate mask and flowing robes. He observed the proceedings with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest in the evening's entertainment, and I noticed that his gaze returned frequently to the sapphire display. Lady Pemberton herself was magnificent as Cleopatra, her silver hair crowned with a diadem of emeralds, her regal bearing commanding, attention even in a room full of theatrical nobility. She moved through her guests with practiced grace, but I detected a certain tension in her manner, the sort of barely perceptible strain that comes from hosting an event where the stakes extend beyond mere social success. The evening progressed with the measured elegance of a well-orchestrated ballet. Champagne flowed like golden rivers, the string quartet played with exquisite precision, and conversations bloomed and faded like exotic flowers in a hothouse. Yet beneath the surface gaiety, I sensed undercurrents of tension, meaningful glances exchanged between certain guests, whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when others approached, and a general atmosphere of expectation that seemed to center on the glowing sapphire. At precisely 11:30, Lady Pemberton called for attention. The music ceased, conversations died away, and all eyes turned toward their hostess as she approached the display case with ceremonial dignity. "My dear friends," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom, "tradition demands that at the stroke of midnight, our guest of honor, the Star of Kashmir, be briefly liberated from its crystal prison so that you might appreciate its full magnificence. The Maharaja who first owned this stone believed that sapphires must breathe the night air to maintain their celestial fire." A murmur of anticipation rippled through the assembled guests. Lady Pemberton withdrew a small silver key from her reticule, its surface gleaming in the chandelier light. The vitrine was fitted with an elaborate lock, a precaution that seemed both necessary and somehow inadequate given the gem's extraordinary value. As the grandfather clock in the adjacent hall began its sonorous countdown to midnight, Lady Pemberton inserted the key and turned it with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the expectant silence. The glass lid rose smoothly on its hinges, and she reached within to lift the sapphire from its velvet cushion. The moment her gloved fingers touched the stone, the lights flickered, not dramatically, but with the subtle uncertainty of electrical systems under strain. In that brief instant of dimmed illumination, something extraordinary occurred. When the lights steadied, perhaps 3 seconds later, Lady Pemberton stood frozen, her hand extended over the display case, her face a mask of absolute bewilderment. The star of cashmere had vanished. The silence that followed was profound, the sort of silence that precedes earthquakes or follows the final notes of a requiem. Lady Pemberton's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "It's gone, the sapphire. It's simply gone." The transformation of the gathering was instantaneous and complete. Elegant society figures became a collection of suspects, their masks now seeming less like festive disguises than attempts at concealment. The mysterious Doge had disappeared entirely. When, I could not say. Dr. Ashford stepped forward, his medical training asserting itself as he steadied Lady Pemberton's trembling form. Sir Reginald examined the empty case with the methodical attention of a man accustomed to solving complex problems, while his wife pressed herself against the wall as if seeking to become invisible. "The doors must be secured immediately," declared Sir Reginald, his business instincts overriding social niceties. "No one can be permitted to leave until this matter is resolved." "But surely," protested Miss Cartwright, her Egyptian queen costume now appearing almost grotesque in the harsh reality of the moment. "Surely this must be some sort of elaborate jest. The sapphire cannot simply have vanished into thin air." Yet vanished it had, as thoroughly as if it had never existed. The display case remained intact, its lock undamaged, the velvet cushion bearing only the faint impression where the great stone had rested moments before. The theft had occurred in full view of 50 witnesses, yet no one had seen anything amiss. As the implications of the situation settled over the gathering like a shroud, I found myself thinking of my friend Hercule Poirot, undoubtedly asleep in his immaculate flat, his patent leather shoes arranged with geometric precision, his mind at rest after another day of imposing order upon chaos. How he would relish this puzzle, a crime committed in plain sight, an impossible theft that challenged every assumption about the nature of evidence and observation. "I believe," I announced, with more confidence than I felt, "that we require the services of a very particular sort of detective. With your permission, Lady Pemberton, I should like to telephone Monsieur Hercule Poirot." The name carried weight even in that shocked assembly. Lady Pemberton nodded mutely, and as I made my way toward the telephone in the library, I could not suppress a smile. My friend would not thank me for disturbing his rest, but he would never forgive me for allowing such a delicious mystery to proceed without his participation. The game, as they say, was about to begin in earnest. The telephone in Lady Pemberton's private study seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed atmosphere as I lifted the receiver with trembling fingers. The familiar number connected after 3 rings, and I heard the precise, if drowsy, voice of my friend. "Hello? Poirot speaking." "Poirot, it's Hastings. Forgive the ungodly hour, but I find myself in the midst of the most extraordinary circumstances. A sapphire worth £50,000 has vanished from Lady Pemberton's masquerade, disappeared from her very hands before 50 witnesses. The brief pause that followed was pregnant with professional interest. "Mon ami, you have the talent for discovering the impossible, n'est-ce pas? Tell me, the scene, it is secured." "Sir Reginald is managing that now. The doors are guarded, no one has departed. The theft occurred at the precise moment the lights flickered. some electrical surge, and when they steadied, the star of cashmere had simply vanished. Très bien. You will touch nothing, disturb nothing. The psychology of the moment after the crime, it is most revealing. I come immediately. When I returned to the ballroom, the transformation was complete and unsettling. The festive masquerade had become a scene from a drawing-room thriller, with guests clustered in nervous groups, their elaborate costumes now seeming less like elegant disguises than attempts at concealment. Sir Reginald Blackwood had assumed command with the efficiency of a military strategist, positioning footmen at every exit while maintaining the pretense that these were merely precautionary measures. Lady Pemberton remained seated near the violated display case, her Cleopatra costume appearing almost grotesque in the harsh reality of the situation. Dr. Ashford hovered solicitously, his medical bag having materialized from somewhere, though whether his ministrations addressed shock or genuine illness remained unclear. Miss Cartwright moved through the assembly with nervous efficiency, her Egyptian queen costume rustling as she attempted to maintain some semblance of order while fielding whispered inquiries from increasingly agitated guests. The most conspicuous absence was that of the mysterious Venetian doge, whose disappearance had been noted by several guests but explained by none. His vanishing act added an additional layer of intrigue to an already baffling crime, and I observed how various individuals reacted to mentions of his absence, some with genuine puzzlement, others with barely concealed anxiety. Poirot arrived with characteristic promptness, his immaculate appearance unmarred by the late hour or hurried journey. His gray-green eyes swept the scene with the methodical precision of a general surveying a battlefield, taking in the positioning of guests, the secured exits, and the palpable atmosphere of mutual suspicion that had settled over the gathering like a shroud. "Madame," he said, approaching Lady Pemberton with a courtly bow, "you have my sympathies for this most distressing occurrence. We shall restore both your property and your peace of mind, I assure you." "Monsieur Poirot," she replied, offering her hand with visible relief, "your reputation precedes you. If anyone can solve this impossible puzzle, surely it is you." "Impossible?" Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "There is no such thing as impossible, madame, only that which we do not yet comprehend. But first, we must see the faces. A masquerade is charming for pleasure, but for the truth, one requires clarity." His request that all masks be removed met with varying degrees of reluctance, but the quiet authority in his compact figure proved irresistible. As the elaborate disguises were set aside, the guests were transformed paradoxically into their recognizable selves, though the removal of concealment seemed only to heighten the atmosphere of suspicion rather than dispel it. "The gentleman in the Venetian costume?" Poirot inquired with deceptive mildness. "When was he last observed?" The question produced an uncomfortable stirring among the assembly. A young maid, pale with nervousness, curtsied and stammered, "Begging your pardon, sir, but he hasn't been seen since the lights went queer, though the doors were sealed directly after." "Precisely," Poirot murmured, his gaze moving thoughtfully over the assembled faces. "He remains among us, if he remains at all. The masquerade continues for him alone." He approached the empty display case with reverent attention, studying not the violated lock or the barren velvet cushion, but rather the space itself, as if drawing meaning from the very air. "Now then," he announced, turning to face the gathering with the satisfied expression of a conductor preparing to begin a complex symphony, "we shall proceed with method. Each person will describe precisely where they stood, what they observed, and what they felt during those crucial moments when the impossible became reality." The investigation had begun in earnest. Poirot arranged the questioning with characteristic precision, requesting that chairs be brought from the adjacent card room and positioned in a careful semicircle before the violated display case. The setting served a dual purpose, maintaining the scene's integrity while creating an intimate atmosphere conducive to revelation. I observed how each suspect's demeanor shifted as they took their appointed place, the removal of their masks having stripped away more than mere disguise. Lady Pemberton spoke first, her voice steady despite the tremor in her jeweled hands. "The key has never left my possession, Monsieur Poirot. I showed it to the assembly before inserting it. A theatrical gesture, perhaps. But tradition demanded it. When I reached for the sapphire, I felt its weight for perhaps a second, solid and real beneath my gloves. Then the lights flickered. No more than 3 heartbeats, and there was nothing but empty air. "The sensation of the stone itself," Poirot inquired with gentle persistence. "You are certain you felt its physical presence?" "Absolutely. The star of Kashmir has a distinctive coolness, even through silk gloves. For that brief moment, it was undeniably there." Sir Reginald Blackwood followed, his businessman's precision evident despite the evening's chaos. I positioned myself near the champagne service, perhaps 15 feet from the display. My attention was divided between Lady Pemberton's ceremony and the approaching storm. The wind had been rising all evening, rattling the French windows quite persistently. When the electrical disturbance occurred, I assumed it was merely the old wiring responding to the weather. This mention of weather intrigued Poirot considerably. "The storm, monsieur? You observed it throughout the evening?" "Indeed. Several guests remarked upon it. The barometric pressure seemed to affect the electrical systems. We've had similar issues during previous gatherings." Dr. Ashford's testimony carried the weight of medical training. I observed Lady Pemberton from a professional standpoint. She had seemed somewhat strained throughout the evening. Elevated pulse, slight perspiration despite the cool temperature. During the crucial moment, I noticed her hand trembled as she reached for the stone. The electrical disturbance lasted approximately 3 seconds, during which several guests reacted with visible alarm. "Which guests particularly?" Miss Cartwright stepped backward quite suddenly. Mrs. Blackwood pressed herself against the wall. Most significantly, the gentleman in the Venetian costume moved toward the French windows during the disturbance itself. Miss Cartwright's nervousness intensified under questioning, her Egyptian queen costume rustling with each agitated movement. I was near the orchestra, arranging final details for the charity auction announcement. When the lights dimmed, the shadows seemed to shift in the most peculiar manner. For a moment it appeared as if there were more people present than actually were. Reflections, perhaps, or tricks of the flickering light. Mrs. Blackwood's testimony proved briefer but equally revealing. Her fragile disposition, emphasized by her geisha costume, made her words seem almost ethereal. I felt frightened, not of the darkness, but of something else entirely. There was a wrongness in the air. When the lights dimmed, I pressed myself against the wall because something seemed to move past me, though I saw nothing clearly. The most illuminating testimony came from Thomas, a young footman positioned near the French windows. "The gentleman in the Venetian mask did approach our area during the disturbance, sir, just as Dr. Ashford observed. But here's the peculiar thing. When the light steadied, he had vanished entirely. Not relocated, sir, but gone completely. I was watching that section specifically because the wind was creating such a racket against the glass. The windows themselves remained secured. Locked tight, sir. I checked them immediately on Sir Reginald's orders, but there was definitely a draught coming from somewhere. Cold air, despite the locked windows and the warmth of the ballroom." Poirot's grey-green eyes swept the assembled faces, noting how each revelation affected the others. The mysterious Venetian doge's disappearance, the inexplicable draught, the universal agreement on timing coupled with the complete absence of concrete observations during those crucial 3 seconds. Each detail added another layer to an increasingly complex puzzle. "Mes amis," he announced, rising from his chair with characteristic precision, "you have been most cooperative. The facts, they begin to arrange themselves in patterns. But now we must examine what the eyes could not see during those moments of darkness." He moved toward the French windows with purposeful steps, his compact figure radiating quiet authority. The investigation was entering a new phase, and I sensed that my friend's remarkable mind was already beginning to perceive connections invisible to the rest of us. Poirot's examination of the French windows proceeded with the methodical precision of a master clockmaker inspecting a delicate mechanism. His gloved fingers traced the ornate frames, while his keen eyes studied every detail through his small magnifying glass, the assembled guests watching in fascination as he revealed secrets hidden in plain sight. "Hastings, mon ami," he murmured without turning from his examination. "Observe the carpet beneath these windows. The dampness, it forms a pattern most curious." Following his direction, I knelt and studied the Persian rug. The moisture was indeed present, but strangely deliberate in its placement. Not random dampness from a leaking window, but something more purposeful. "It's almost as if someone with wet shoes had stood here," I observed. "Précisément? And yet, how does one acquire wet shoes while remaining inside a locked ballroom during a storm?" His question created a visible stir among the witnesses. "Thomas, you spoke of the draught. Show me exactly where you felt it." The young footman approached nervously, pointing to the narrow gap where the windows met. "Right here, sir. A cold rush, just for a moment." Poirot produced his penknife and carefully extracted something from the window frame, a tiny filament, nearly invisible, which he folded into his handkerchief with satisfaction. "The locks show signs of recent lubrication, professional work, not crude oil applied hastily." Sir Reginald's business acumen engaged immediately. "You're suggesting premeditation? Someone prepared these windows in advance?" "The evidence suggests preparation, certainly. But preparation for what, precisely?" Poirot moved to examine the marble floor surrounding the display case, his magnifying glass revealing faint scuff marks that formed a partial circle. Multiple sets of footprints arranged not randomly, but with purpose. The pattern suggests choreographed movement, perhaps even practiced in advance. Mrs. Blackwood's voice trembled. "Are you saying this was planned by multiple people, a conspiracy?" "The physical evidence suggests coordination, madame. But conspiracy implies shared guilt, and that remains to be determined." Poirot's gaze swept the assembled faces, noting reactions carefully. "What we have established is that this crime required intimate knowledge of the house, access for preparation, and precise timing." Lady Pemberton's composure cracked slightly. "But who among us would possess such knowledge? These are my dearest friends, my most trusted associates." "Madame, the most successful deceptions are often perpetrated by those we trust most completely." Dr. Ashford stepped forward, his medical training asserting itself. "But surely the obvious explanation is the Venetian gentleman. He positioned himself near the windows, disappeared during the confusion." "Ah, the mysterious Doge," Poirot interrupted, his eyes twinkling with familiar skepticism. "Tell me, did anyone here know this gentleman? Had anyone spoken to him at length?" A murmur of negative responses swept through the room. No one could recall seeing him arrive or place him among their acquaintances. He had been a phantom, perfectly suited to both masquerade and vanishing act. "A convenient phantom indeed," Poirot mused. "He appears, he observes, he positions himself, and then, at the crucial moment, he disappears. Too neat, perhaps?" Miss Cartwright ventured nervously. "But if he simply took the sapphire and slipped away—" "Ah, but consider the psychology, mademoiselle. Does a man who plans such a daring theft choose a costume that makes him utterly anonymous, only to position himself conspicuously? Does he risk being seen near the windows, only to vanish from a room that is, by all accounts, sealed?" Poirot walked slowly back to the display case, his voice taking on the tone of gentle instruction. "The disappearance of our Venetian friend, while intriguing, feels too simple, too much like the red herring designed to distract the little grey cells from the true nature of the crime." He paused, allowing his words to penetrate. "The key, Lady Pemberton, was in your hand. The sapphire, for a moment, was in your hand. And then it was not. The question is not merely who took it, but how it was taken in those 3 precious seconds of darkness from a place of apparent security. His eyes settled on the empty velvet cushion, then slowly rose to meet the assembled faces. The truly logical mind does not accept the most convenient explanation. It examines all possibilities, especially the inconvenient ones. Thomas cleared his throat nervously. "Begging your pardon, sir, but there's something else. Earlier this evening, before the guests arrived, I noticed someone in the garden. Thought it was just staff making preparations, but now you wonder if perhaps someone was conducting reconnaissance," Poirot finished, his interest clearly piqued. "The investigation deepens, mes amis. The obvious suspect has been presented and dismissed. Now we must examine the true complexity of human nature and deception." The first false lead had been elegantly disposed of, and the psychological game was about to begin in earnest. Poirot's attention sharpened at Thomas's revelation, his gray-green eyes focusing with laser-like intensity on the young footman. The assembled guests leaned forward unconsciously, sensing that this new thread might unravel the entire mystery. "This figure in the garden. Describe precisely what you observed, mon ami. In a case such as this, the smallest detail may prove the key that unlocks all doors." Thomas shifted uncomfortably under the collective gaze, his nervousness evident as he wrung his white gloves. "It was perhaps 2 hours before the guests began arriving, sir. I was securing the French windows against the approaching storm when I glimpsed movement near the rose arbor. At first I assumed it was Jenkins, the head gardener, making final preparations. But you discovered it was not Jenkins." "That's just it, sir. When I mentioned it to Jenkins later, he claimed to have been in the greenhouse all afternoon. Said he'd seen no one in the garden proper." Thomas paused, then reached into his waistcoat pocket. "But there's more, sir. After the figure departed, I found this caught on the rose bushes, right by the French windows where the ground was muddy from the rain." He produced a small, intricately carved wooden button, dark and polished, with a distinctive oriental design that matched the evening's theme perfectly. The collective gasp that rippled through the room was audible, and I observed how several guests instinctively glanced at their own costumes. Poirot accepted the button with reverent care, turning it over in his palm while his keen eyes studied its craftsmanship. "Indeed, this is a very specific type of button, hand-carved, expensive, and distinctly oriental in design. It matches the evening's theme rather too perfectly, does it not?" Sir Reginald's business instincts engaged immediately, his gaze sweeping the assembled guests with predatory intensity. "This is concrete evidence, Monsieur Poirot. Someone was outside those windows, preparing for the theft. We need only match this button to its owner." His eyes settled on his wife, with dawning horror. Mrs. Blackwood's geisha costume was adorned with numerous such delicate, dark wooden buttons, and her face had drained of all color as she instinctively clutched at the front of her kimono. "Clarissa!" Sir Reginald exclaimed, his voice carrying a mixture of accusation and disbelief. "Is that from your costume? You admitted to being in the garden earlier." Mrs. Blackwood's fragile composure cracked completely. I don't know, Reginald. I might have lost one. I was feeling faint and stepped outside for air before the guests arrived. But I would never... The atmosphere in the room crystallized around this revelation. Several guests murmured amongst themselves, their initial sympathy for the fragile woman quickly transforming into suspicion. The idea of the quiet, overlooked wife being behind such a daring crime possessed a certain dramatic appeal that seemed to satisfy the Assembly's need for resolution. "There we have it," Sir Reginald declared with grim satisfaction. "Physical evidence, opportunity, access to the house. What more proof do we require?" Poirot, however, remained curiously unmoved by this apparent breakthrough. He continued to study the button with thoughtful intensity, his thumb tracing its intricate pattern while his gray-green eyes held that peculiar gleam I had learned to associate with profound skepticism. "This is indeed a most interesting development," he murmured, his gaze shifting from the button to the faces around him. A button, found outside the window, belonging to a guest who admits to being in the garden prior to the event. Physical evidence of the highest order, certainly. He paused, allowing the weight of expectation to build before continuing with characteristic precision. However, while the police might find this sufficiently compelling to close their file, my little grey cells whisper a different story entirely. Sir Reginald frowned impatiently. "What could be clearer, Monsieur Poirot? We have motive, opportunity, and physical evidence." "It is precisely because it appears so clear that I find it suspect, mon ami. Consider the psychology of our criminal. Someone capable of planning such a sophisticated operation, the window preparation, the precise timing, the coordination with the electrical disturbance. Would they be so careless as to drop such a distinctive piece of evidence directly at the scene of their preparation?" Poirot held up the button, allowing it to catch the light. "This tells us a story, yes, but not the story we think we hear. It speaks of preparation, certainly, but preparation by someone who wished to be discovered, or more precisely, someone who wished another to be discovered in their place." The room's atmosphere shifted palpably as his words sank in. Mrs. Blackwood looked up with desperate gratitude, while Sir Reginald's expression transformed from triumph to bewildered frustration. "The first false lead has been presented and accepted," Poirot announced with quiet satisfaction. "Now the true psychological game begins in earnest." Poirot's dismissal of the button evidence created a palpable shift in the room's atmosphere, as if the very air had thickened with renewed uncertainty. The comfortable resolution that had begun to crystallize around Mrs. Blackwood's apparent guilt dissolved like sugar in rain, leaving the assembled guests more unsettled than before. "The psychology of misdirection," Poirot continued, his voice carrying that peculiar authority that commanded absolute attention, "is perhaps the most sophisticated tool in the criminal's arsenal. Our thief has provided not one but two convenient scapegoats, the vanishing Venetian for those who prefer dramatic solutions, and this planted button for those who require tangible evidence." He held up the carved wooden button, allowing it to catch the chandelier light. "Consider the mentality required for such planning. Someone who understands that different minds seek different types of proof. Someone who can anticipate how we would react to each revelation." Sir Reginald's business instincts engaged with visible frustration. "But if not Clarissa, then who? We cannot simply dismiss every piece of evidence as elaborate deception." "Ah, but we can examine how that evidence speaks to us," Poirot replied, moving toward the empty display case with purposeful steps. "With your permission, I should like to conduct a small experiment. A reconstruction, if you will, not of the theft itself, but of the psychological moment surrounding it." He requested that the servants restore the room's arrangement to match the crucial midnight moment, positioning each guest precisely where they had stood during the Sapphire's disappearance. The vitrine was returned to its exact location, and a crystal paperweight was placed upon the velvet cushion as a substitute for the missing gem. "Thomas," Poirot instructed the young footman, "you will create another brief electrical disturbance, nothing dramatic, merely a momentary dimming as before." As the lights flickered and steadied, Poirot's keen eyes swept not toward the substitute sapphire, but toward the faces around him. In that brief moment of artificial twilight, human nature revealed itself in unconscious gestures and involuntary reactions. Miss Cartwright's hand moved instinctively toward her sleeve, a smoothing gesture that spoke of nervous habit. Dr. Ashford's fingers tapped twice against his medical bag, a mechanical rhythm that suggested familiarity with tension. Sir Reginald's gaze darted toward the French windows before forcing itself back, the movement barely controlled. "You see," Poirot murmured as full illumination returned, "the body remembers what the mind wishes to forget. Under stress, we rehearse our secrets through unconscious movement." He approached Miss Cartwright with gentle precision. "Mademoiselle, you coordinate every detail of Lady Pemberton's social calendar, do you not? including the engagement of tradespeople, perhaps electricians, to address the persistent lighting difficulties. Her composure wavered visibly. Yes, I arranged for Blakeney and Sons to inspect the circuits last week. But there was no planned effect, no deliberate manipulation of the lighting. Yet you alone would know the electrical system's vulnerabilities, the precise moments when a minor disturbance might occur naturally, or be encouraged to occur unnaturally. Lady Pemberton's voice carried a note of protective concern. Vivienne has been absolutely loyal, Monsieur Poirot. If you're suggesting, I suggest nothing, madame. I merely observe that loyalty, when strained by circumstance, can take unexpected forms. His gaze shifted to Dr. Ashford. Monsieur le Docteur, your medical training teaches observation of symptoms, does it not? Tonight, have you noticed any behavioral indicators that might suggest a mind under extraordinary pressure? Dr. Ashford adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully. Everyone present shows signs of stress, naturally. However, I've observed certain patterns. Miss Cartwright has displayed classic symptoms of anticipatory anxiety. Elevated pulse, slight tremor, hypervigilance. Anticipatory anxiety, Poirot repeated with interest. Anxiety about what is to come rather than what has already occurred. Most illuminating. He moved to examine the collection of gloves and masks that had been arranged on the sideboard at his earlier request. His hands hovered over them without touching, his eyes studying details invisible to the rest of us. The criminal among us, he announced, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality, understands that this investigation will not end with the dismissal of convenient scapegoats. They know that my methods will eventually expose the truth, and so they will be compelled to act again, to attempt some desperate measure to prevent revelation or to complete their original design. The room fell into profound silence, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder as the storm continued its assault on London. I make this prediction with confidence, Poirot continued, his grey-green eyes sweeping the assembled faces. Before dawn breaks, our criminal will reveal themselves through action, not words. The psychological pressure will prove unbearable, and they will make the fatal error that transforms suspicion into certainty. Poirot's words seemed to crystallize the very air around us, and I observed how each guest absorbed his prediction with varying degrees of unease. The psychological pressure he had so carefully cultivated was beginning to produce its intended effect. Someone among them was feeling the inexorable weight of his methodical approach bearing down upon their carefully constructed deceptions. Lady Pemberton, attempting to restore some semblance of normalcy, suggested that refreshments be served in the morning room while Poirot continued his investigation. As the group began to move, I noticed Miss Cartwright lingering near the French windows, her Egyptian costume rustling as she appeared to study something on the carpet with unusual intensity. Hastings, Poirot murmured quietly, positioning himself where he could observe both Miss Cartwright and the departing guests. You will note that our secretary finds something of particular interest near the scene of our mysterious draught. Indeed, Miss Cartwright had knelt beside the Persian rug, her fingers tracing the dampness patterns that Poirot had earlier identified. Her movements were purposeful, almost practiced, as if she were searching for something specific, rather than merely examining evidence. When Dr. Ashford approached with professional concern about her pallor, she started violently, her hand jerking away from the carpet as if it had burned her. The pattern of moisture seemed so unusual, she stammered, rising hastily and smoothing her costume with trembling hands. Indeed it is unusual, Poirot observed, approaching with characteristic quiet authority. The dampness forms a very specific shape, as if someone had stood here with wet clothing, allowing moisture to drip in a controlled pattern. Before Miss Cartwright could respond, Sir Reginald's voice erupted from the corridor in alarm. Good God! Someone's been at the study safe! We rushed to Lady Pemberton's private study, where an ornate wall safe stood open, its contents scattered. Lady Pemberton pressed her hands to her throat, her face a mask of horror as she surveyed the violation. "My insurance documents," she gasped. "The provenance papers for the entire collection, they're gone. And the anonymous letter I received on Tuesday, warning that the sapphire must breathe the night air at midnight, that too has vanished." Poirot examined the safe with intense interest, his magnifying glass revealing scratches around the combination dial that spoke of recent, careful manipulation. The lock shows no signs of forcing. Someone knew the combination or possessed exceptional skill in such matters. "But why take documents?" Dr. Ashford asked, his medical logic struggling with criminal psychology. But consider the implications, mon docteur. Without provenance, the Star of Kashmir becomes merely a beautiful stone of questionable origin. With proper documentation, it transforms into a legitimate treasure that can be sold openly, without the complications that plague stolen goods. Miss Cartwright had grown increasingly agitated during this exchange, her hands wringing the fabric of her costume. "This is madness," she declared, her voice rising toward hysteria. "First the sapphire vanishes, now documents disappear. It's as if the very house conspires against us." "Not the house, mademoiselle," Poirot replied with gentle precision. "But someone who understands that successful theft requires more than mere acquisition. It requires the ability to transform stolen goods into legitimate property." He moved to examine the study window, noting signs of recent attention. The lock had been oiled, and faint moisture patterns suggested it had been opened during the storm. His keen eyes swept the room, settling on the carpet where a distinctive pattern of water droplets led from the window to the safe. "Our criminal has been most thorough," he observed. "The sapphire, the documentation, and an escape route prepared with meticulous care. But observe, Hastings, the footprints entering are deep and purposeful, while those departing are lighter, hurried. Someone left this room in considerable haste." Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "Begging your pardon, sir, but there's been movement in the garden. The constables report someone attempted to approach the service entrance not 20 minutes ago, a figure in dark clothing moving through the grounds despite the storm." Poirot's prediction was proving disturbingly accurate. The psychological pressure had indeed compelled someone to desperate action, and the second crime had revealed not resolution, but deeper layers of calculated deception. Poirot's response to Thomas's report was characteristically measured, his grey-green eyes sharpening with professional interest rather than alarm. He did not rush toward the door, as others might have done, but instead remained perfectly still, his head tilted slightly as if listening to some melody audible only to his trained senses. "The constables will maintain their positions," he instructed with quiet authority, "but no dramatic pursuits, if you please. A cornered animal becomes desperate, and desperation leads to mistakes we are not yet prepared to exploit." Rather than pursuing the mysterious figure, Poirot returned to Lady Pemberton's violated study, his attention drawn not to what had been taken, but to what might have been left behind. He approached the leather-bound blotter on the desk with reverent care, lifting its top sheet and angling it toward the lamp with practiced precision. "Always the little impressions, Hastings," he murmured, his voice carrying that familiar note of satisfaction. "Paper possesses a memory more reliable than human recollection." I leaned closer and gasped at what the lamplight revealed. Pressed into the paper, faint as ghostly writing, were words reversed by pressure, but perfectly legible to the trained eye. "Breathe the night air at midnight." Beneath that, a fragment. "Ensure the key is displayed." Lady Pemberton uttered a soft exclamation of recognition. Those phrases. They match exactly the anonymous letter that was stolen. "Précisément," Poirot replied, carefully returning the blotting paper to its position while palming an almost invisible curl of black residue caught in the paper's fibers. "The letter was composed here, in this very room, by someone with intimate access to your private study." His attention shifted to the window, where he knelt to examine the recently oiled lock mechanism. Drawing a delicate breath, his nostrils flared slightly. The lubricant is not common machine oil, but something far more specialized, camphorated with medicinal properties. One uses such preparations for delicate instruments that must not corrode. Dr. Ashford's face colored noticeably. Many oils possess similar aromatic qualities, Monsieur Poirot. I would hesitate to draw specific conclusions from such evidence. I do not draw conclusions hastily, mon docteur, Poirot replied with dangerous gentleness. I merely observe what others overlook. There is a significant difference between the two approaches. Before the tension could escalate further, a constable appeared in the doorway, rain glistening on his cape. Begging your pardon, sir, but we've discovered these items just inside the garden hedge near the service gate. He presented a sodden bundle, a heavy black cloak, an ornate Venetian mask, and caught within the cloak's lining, a small brass spindle wound with nearly invisible filament. The collective murmur that swept through the assembled guests carried notes of both relief and renewed suspicion. Sir Reginald seized upon the discovery with obvious satisfaction. There's your phantom thief, Monsieur Poirot. The theatrical equipment, the escape route. Surely this resolves the mystery completely. Poirot examined the items with characteristic thoroughness, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Indeed, we have discovered precisely what any reasonable investigator would expect to find. The tools of an impossible crime, conveniently abandoned where they would certainly be discovered. His tone carried a note of gentle skepticism that transformed triumph into uncertainty. In my experience, when fishing, one must always consider who has baited the hook and for what purpose. Returning to the ballroom, Poirot positioned himself before the empty vitrine with the solemnity of a priest before an altar. The assembled guests watched with growing unease as he addressed them with quiet authority. I shall make an announcement of considerable importance, he declared, his voice carrying easily across the hushed room. The documents removed from Lady Pemberton's safe bear a watermark invisible to casual inspection. When subjected to heat, this mark becomes immediately apparent, revealing the identity of anyone attempting to dispose of stolen property. It was, I realized with growing admiration, a complete fabrication delivered with such conviction that even I, momentarily, believed it. The effect on the assembled guests was immediate and revealing. Faces that had shown relief now registered calculation and renewed anxiety. Poirot's gaze swept the room with methodical precision, noting every reaction, every unconscious gesture, every betraying expression. His little gray cells had assembled the crucial pieces of this elaborate puzzle, and the hidden clue was beginning to reveal itself with crystalline clarity. The psychological pressure was mounting inexorably, and I sensed that our criminal would soon be compelled to make the fatal error that would transform suspicion into certainty. Poirot's fabricated announcement about the watermarked documents produced precisely the effect he had calculated. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted like a tide, carrying with it the subtle currents of guilt, fear, and desperate calculation. I observed how each guest absorbed the implications differently, some with visible relief, others with barely concealed anxiety, and one with the particular stillness that comes from a mind frantically reassessing its position in a deadly game. Miss Cartwright's reaction was particularly striking. Her Egyptian queen costume seemed to diminish around her frame as she pressed herself against the ornate wallpaper, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. When Dr. Ashford moved toward her with professional concern, she waved him away with trembling hands, her gaze fixed on Poirot with something approaching terror. The psychological pressure, Poirot murmured to me in an undertone, produces results more reliable than any physical evidence. Observe how truth begins to surface through involuntary response. Rather than pursuing immediate confrontation, Poirot returned to the violated display case with renewed purpose. He withdrew his small magnifying glass and examined the brass hinges with meticulous attention, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the mounting tension in the room. Hastings, if you please. he called softly, and when I joined him, he bent fractionally at the waist, his gaze fixed on the interior edge of the glass lid. There, where the hinge meets the frame. Do you observe? At first I saw nothing but polished brass and crystal. Then the chandelier light caught something so fine it seemed almost imaginary, a thread lodged where the mechanism joined the frame. Poirot coaxed it free with the gentlest touch of his penknife, and it clung to the blade like spider silk, nearly invisible yet undeniably present. "From our little cache in the garden," he said softly, "we recovered a spindle wound with filament. Earlier, in the window frame, I discovered its cousin. The continued presence of this thread here tells a most illuminating story." He straightened, his gray-green eyes bright with the satisfaction of a puzzle piece clicking into place. "Visualize, mon ami. In darkness lasting 3 seconds, a fine filament is drawn taut. The stone lifts, not by magic, but by the most elegant mechanical design. The path of this thread we shall now discover." Moving to the marble base surrounding the display case, Poirot knelt and studied the faint scuff marks he had noted earlier. Under his trained examination, they arranged themselves into a partial arc, the curve of a line drawn under tension. He followed this invisible trajectory with a fingertip, then stood and measured an angle toward the French windows with his characteristic precision. "The mechanism becomes clear," he announced, his voice carrying that note of quiet triumph I had learned to recognize. "But mechanism alone does not solve our puzzle. We must also consider the psychology of preparation." He moved toward Dr. Ashford with deceptive casualness. "Mon docteur, your medical training requires familiarity with specialized lubricants, does it not? Preparations that will not corrode delicate instruments." Dr. Ashford's composure wavered slightly. "Many oils possess medicinal properties, Monsieur Poirot. I would hesitate to draw specific conclusions from such general observations." "Indeed, one must be precise," Poirot agreed mildly. He withdrew the small curl of black residue he had collected from Lady Pemberton's blotter, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger. "Lampblack. Very fine quality. One smokes a key over flame to take its impression, then presses the blackened surface to paper or soft soap. With plaster or wax, one creates a duplicate. Most ingenious." The effect of this revelation rippled through the assembled guests like a stone cast into still water. Miss Cartwright's hand moved instinctively toward her sleeve, and something small slipped from the fabric, a wafer-thin cake of mottled soap, which she retrieved with such desperate haste that the motion itself betrayed her anxiety. "Ah," Poirot observed with gentle precision, "soap for the convenience of guests who may require to freshen their hands. But this particular variety, soft, easily impressed, ideal for capturing the details of a key's surface. I carry it because scented soaps irritate my skin," Miss Cartwright stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course, mademoiselle, a perfectly reasonable explanation." Poirot did not press the point, but his knowing glance spoke volumes. Returning to the display case, he slipped the recovered filament into his waistcoat pocket, then performed a swift movement that only I, standing close, could observe clearly. He eased a fingernail under the velvet cushion and lifted it a fraction, revealing the underside. There, barely visible, was a neat pin slit, a tiny incision where a thread could pass without disturbing the surface appearance. His gaze traveled upward to the ornate chandelier, then onward to the French windows where the curtains were held back by carved wooden tie-backs. The path of the filament became clear, from cushion to ceiling fixture to window, creating an invisible highway for the most audacious theft. "Thomas," Poirot called to the young footman, "bring me a length of stout twine and that crystal paperweight we used earlier." In the hushed atmosphere of the ballroom, he threaded the twine where the filament had lain, passing it through the hinge mechanism, under the cushion's edge, over a chandelier arm, and toward the curtain tie-back. With a swift, practiced motion, he tugged the line. The paperweight slid across the velvet, rose smoothly into the air, and came to rest against the window drapery. "The principle is demonstrated," he announced with quiet satisfaction. "Not magic, but mechanics. Not impossibility, but ingenious preparation." The demonstration sent a visible shudder through the assembled guests. The crime that had seemed supernatural was revealed as elegant engineering requiring intimate knowledge of the house, careful preparation, and precise timing. "Our criminal," Poirot continued, his voice taking on the hypnotic quality that commanded absolute attention, "understood that the most successful deceptions combine mechanical ingenuity with psychological misdirection. They provided us with phantom thieves and planted evidence, knowing that different minds seek different types of proof." He moved to stand before the assembled guests, his compact figure radiating quiet authority. "The pressure of investigation now compels our criminal toward desperate action. They know that my methods will eventually expose every deception, every carefully constructed alibi. The psychological strain becomes unbearable." Lady Pemberton's voice carried a note of desperate hope. "Then you know who committed this crime?" "I know many things, madame. I know the method, the preparation, the misdirection. I know that our criminal possesses intimate knowledge of your household, access to your private study, understanding of electrical systems, and the surgical precision of one trained in delicate procedures." His gray-green eyes swept the room with methodical precision. "But knowledge and proof, they are different creatures entirely." The storm outside continued its assault on the windows, and I sensed that we were approaching the eye of our own tempest. Poirot's careful psychological pressure was reaching its crescendo, and the final gathering, with all its revelations and confrontations, was about to commence. "In 15 minutes, Poirot announced with the quiet certainty that stiffened every spine in the room, "I shall require all to be present for the final act of this masquerade. There remains one small verification to complete before we remove the last mask and reveal the face beneath." The 15 minutes that followed Poirot's announcement were employed with characteristic precision, each moment serving his methodical approach to revelation. Rather than rushing toward confrontation, he used this interval to complete his investigation with a thoroughness that had made his reputation legendary throughout Europe. I observed him return to the French windows, where he produced a small pair of scissors and carefully examined the ornate curtain tiebacks. With the delicate touch of a surgeon, he located and extracted a silk cocoon no thicker than a seam, which he slipped into his waistcoat pocket without opening. His magnifying glass revealed something else of significance. The cut ends of the filament showed the distinctive pattern of a surgeon's knot, a habit of fingers trained in precise, delicate work. Moving to Lady Pemberton's reticule, which had remained on the sideboard since the evening's festivities began, Poirot discovered within its silk lining a ghostly smear of lampblack, the same substance that had left its impression on the study's blotter. The connection between the anonymous letter and the key duplication was now complete. The same hand that composed the warning also prepared the duplicate key, he murmured to me, his satisfaction evident. But more revealing still is the choice of lubricant for the window mechanism, camphorated oil, the type used for delicate medical instruments. When the assembly reconvened in the ballroom, the atmosphere had transformed from anxious anticipation to the profound solemnity that precedes judgment. The guests arranged themselves in a semicircle before the empty vitrine, their oriental costumes now seeming less like festive disguises than the elaborate masks worn by players in an ancient tragedy. Poirot positioned himself with ceremonial gravity, his compact figure commanding absolute attention despite the grandeur of his surroundings. "Mes amis," he began, his voice carrying that familiar authority, "we have witnessed a crime of extraordinary sophistication, not merely mechanical, but psychological in its conception." He gestured toward the display case where his earlier demonstration had revealed the filament's path. "The method I showed you was indeed possible, and indeed employed, but method alone does not solve our mystery. We must examine who possessed the knowledge, opportunity, and desperate motivation to execute such an audacious plan. His gray-green eyes swept methodically over each face. Our criminal required intimate knowledge of this household's routines, access to Lady Pemberton's private study, understanding of electrical systems, and the surgical precision of one trained in delicate procedures. Most significantly, they needed the psychological sophistication to provide multiple layers of misdirection. He moved toward Miss Cartwright with measured steps. "Mademoiselle, you coordinate every aspect of Lady Pemberton's social calendar, including the engagement of tradespeople. You arranged for Blakeney and Sons to inspect the electrical circuits, giving you precise knowledge of when natural disturbances might occur, or be encouraged to occur." Miss Cartwright's Egyptian costume rustled as she pressed herself against the wall, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The electrical problems have been persistent." "Indeed they have," Poirot agreed gently. "But you also possess access to Lady Pemberton's study, where the anonymous letter was composed. Its impression remains on the blotter, and traces of lamp-black answer in your employer's own reticule. You observed her handle the combination to the safe countless times, learning it through proximity and duty." He withdrew the silk cocoon from his pocket, holding it delicately. This was sewn into the curtain tie-back, a small pouch to catch the sapphire when the filament drew it across the room. The thread itself came from your costume, as this fragment lodged in the vitrine's hinge confirms. Dr. Ashford stepped forward, his medical training asserting itself. "But Vivian has been absolutely loyal to Lady Pemberton. What possible motive—" "Ah, mon docteur, you ask the essential question." Poirot's voice carried profound sadness. "Loyalty, when strained by desperate circumstances, can transform into something quite different. The gambling debts accumulated over months of attempting to improve modest circumstances. The loan sharks making increasingly violent threats. The realization that a single sapphire represented more than 15 years of faithful service would ever provide." Miss Cartwright's composure finally shattered completely. Her trembling hands reached into the hidden pocket of her costume, withdrawing the star of cashmere, its blue fire seeming dimmed by the circumstances of its revelation. "She never noticed," she whispered, her voice carrying years of accumulated resentment. "Never saw how I sacrificed everything to maintain her perfect world while my own crumbled. The sapphire was just another bauble to her, but to me it meant survival itself." The confession hung in the air like incense, heavy with human frailty and desperate circumstance. Poirot's expression carried no triumph, only the profound sadness of one who had witnessed too often how ordinary people were driven to extraordinary crimes by the simple arithmetic of desperation. "The plan was elegant in its complexity," he observed quietly. "The Venetian accomplice to provide the obvious suspect, the planted button to implicate Mrs. Blackwood when the first explanation proved insufficient, the mechanical demonstration to satisfy those who required logical proof. You understood that different minds seek different types of evidence, and you provided each in turn." Lady Pemberton's voice trembled as she accepted the returned sapphire. 15 years of trust, Vivian. How could you believe I wouldn't have helped if you had simply asked?" The final mask had been removed, revealing not the face of evil, but of ordinary human desperation driven to extraordinary lengths. The masquerade was ended, and truth stood revealed in all its complex, tragic humanity. As the constables moved forward to complete their duty, Poirot turned away from the scene with characteristic dignity, his work complete and his methods once again vindicated by the inexorable logic of human nature under pressure. The constables performed their duty with quiet dignity, though Miss Cartwright's collapse into tearful confession made their task both easier and more heartbreaking. As she was led away, her Egyptian costume trailing behind her like the remnants of a shattered dream, I observed how the remaining guests struggled to reconcile the loyal secretary they had known with the desperate criminal she had become. Lady Pemberton clutched the recovered star of cashmere with trembling hands, its blue fire seeming somehow dimmed by the circumstances of its return. "But how, Monsieur Poirot?" she whispered, her voice carrying profound bewilderment. The speed, the precision, it seemed impossible. Poirot approached her with gentle courtesy, his grey-green eyes reflecting the compassion that always tempered his pursuit of truth. "Madame, the impossible is merely the unsolved. Permit me to illuminate the elegant simplicity that lay beneath this elaborate deception." He gestured toward the display case with characteristic precision. Miss Cartwright possessed every advantage necessary for such an audacious crime. As your trusted secretary, she knew your household's every routine, every vulnerability. She arranged for the electrical inspection, learning precisely when the aging circuits might falter or be encouraged to falter with the briefest manipulation. Moving to demonstrate, Poirot indicated the path his earlier reconstruction had revealed. The anonymous letter she composed in your study, its impression remains on your blotter, served dual purposes. It ensured you would expose the sapphire at the crucial moment, and it provided the pretext for her to handle your key, smoking it with lamp black to create the impression necessary for duplication. The mechanism itself was ingenious in its simplicity. He continued, his voice taking on the instructional tone I'd learned to associate with his greatest revelations. A fine filament, drawn from her own costume, was prepared in advance. One end attached to the sapphire through the pin slit beneath the velvet cushion, invisible to casual observation. The thread ran over the chandelier's ornate metalwork to the curtain tie-back, where a silk cocoon awaited to catch the stone. Dr. Ashford, his medical training engaged, leaned forward with professional interest. But the timing, 3 seconds of darkness, precisely calculated, mon docteur. Miss Cartwright loosened a connection in the west corridor's fuse box, creating the momentary disturbance. When the lights flickered, a swift tug on the prepared filament drew the sapphire across the room in complete darkness. The thread was then released, leaving only the fragment I discovered in the vitrine's hinge mechanism. Sir Reginald's business instincts remained engaged, despite the emotional toll. And the Venetian Doge? The planted evidence? Elaborate misdirection, Poirot replied with satisfaction. The mysterious figure was indeed Miss Cartwright herself, conducting reconnaissance under cover of the storm earlier that evening. She prepared the window locks with camphorated oil borrowed from Dr. Ashford's medical bag, planted the button from Mrs. Blackwood's costume, and arranged the theatrical costume to be discovered as an obvious but false lead. Mrs. Blackwood, vindicated but shaken, accepted her husband's protective embrace with visible relief. The planted evidence that had nearly destroyed her reputation lay forgotten, its deception revealed and its power broken. The psychology was as sophisticated as the mechanics, Poirot observed, his tone growing more philosophical. Miss Cartwright understood that different minds seek different types of proof. She provided the dramatic phantom for those who prefer theatrical solutions, the planted button for those who require tangible evidence, and even prepared to sacrifice her own position, if necessary, to maintain the deception. Lady Pemberton's voice trembled as she studied the recovered sapphire. 15 years of trust, Vivienne. How could you believe I wouldn't have helped if you had simply asked? Ah, madame, Poirot replied with profound sadness. Pride is often the cruelest jailer. The gambling debts, the mounting threats from loan sharks, these created a desperation that blinded her to any solution save theft. She saw the sapphire not as your treasured possession, but as her only salvation from ruin. As dawn painted the French windows with pale gold light, the storm finally subsided, leaving the ballroom strangely peaceful after the night's revelations. The masquerade guests departed with the weary relief of those who had witnessed human nature stripped of its masks, while the servants began the melancholy task of restoring order to chaos. Thomas, the young footman whose observations had proved crucial, received Poirot's personal commendation. Your attention to detail provided essential pieces of our puzzle, mon ami. Such gifts should not be wasted. As we prepared to depart, Poirot paused at the French windows where the investigation had begun. The rose arbor beyond appeared peaceful in the morning light, giving no hint of the elaborate deception it had witnessed. "The masquerade is ended," he observed with characteristic philosophical reflection, "but in truth, do we not all wear masks to conceal our private struggles?" Miss Cartwright's tragedy was believing that her mask must never be removed, even when removal might have brought salvation rather than shame. Our carriage carried us through the awakening streets of London as the city stirred to life, unaware of the drama that had unfolded in Grosvenor House. Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his patent leather shoes reflecting the morning light, his mind already filing away another completed case in the vast catalogue of human nature he had accumulated. "Another impossible crime proved possible," I remarked, attempting to lighten the melancholy that had settled over us both. "There are no impossible crimes, mon ami," he replied with gentle certainty, adjusting his tie with geometric precision. "Only crimes we do not yet understand. The human capacity for ingenuity in service of desperation is perhaps the most predictable element in all detection." As our carriage turned toward his immaculate flat, where order and reason would restore themselves with mathematical precision, Poirot allowed himself one final observation on the affair at the Sapphire Masquerade. "The greatest tragedy, Hastings, is not that Miss Cartwright committed this crime, but that she believed it was her only option. We detect not merely the methods of criminals, but the failures of compassion that create them." The masquerade was ended, justice served, and truth revealed in all its complex, tragic humanity. Yet as London awakened around us, I reflected that the most profound mysteries of human nature remained as inscrutable as ever, waiting for the next case to illuminate their dark complexities. Thus concluded the affair at the Sapphire Masquerade, another testament to the inexorable logic of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells and the enduring frailty of the human heart under pressure.